All right, thank you. And as I said earlier, I'm really happy to be back in Sweden and to see some old friends and some new friends and to hear about this project. I have to say that this afternoon has been so inspiring to think about kind of the sequence of this project and to think back about the planning stages and getting organized and thinking about contacting the preschools and will they really want to participate and all of those kinds of issues. And now here today, hearing about the results and seeing the films and listening to all of you, the teachers and the coaches and administrators. So I have to say it is really inspiring. And then one more thing, I want to thank you for speaking and listening in English this afternoon. I know that for some of you, this is really takes a lot of effort, and you needed that food and drink, right? Because you were worn out, and so I hope that you have some energy to listen for another 45 minutes or so as we wrap up. Well, when I was asked to comment, to give some remarks on the projects, I thought about my own involvement. I was involved from early on in the project, so I thought about how I had participated, or kind of from the sidelines a little bit, but I thought about my involvement. And then I also thought about this idea, this notion of collaboration. And I'm going to expand on that a little bit in my comments. And you've already heard that. So I think that is really, really nice that you can think to what you've already heard this afternoon about those nice instances, those nice examples of collaboration in action, and the examples that we've already heard this today. So I have been, let me see if I do everything correctly here. There we go. I've been involved in both the research school and the research projects that we've heard about today. And as I think about those, I think that the impetus is shared across both the research school and the research projects. And it was a desire to prepare new researchers and to generate new knowledge, to help teachers know and use new, innovative, and effective practices, and then, of course, to conduct meaningful research on educational practices in real-life settings. And we've heard about what that meant to teachers and to coaches and to administrators already today. We've heard some of the results. I hope that's made us kind of hungry to hear about the rest of the results of these projects. Let me tell you a little bit about my involvement. I was often asked to come and give a presentation or participate in conversations with some or all of you about the research. And so if I think back, I don't know if I have all of the timing correct, because it's now become a little bit historical. But my memory is that, first of all, I was asked to talk about effective instructional practices, and drawing from my work on approach to preschool education practices that we call building blocks. So I talked about building blocks. I also talked about the Recommended Practices Project, which is a project in the United States with our professional organization to identify effective practices that preschool teachers and early interventionists can and should be using in their classrooms and their programs. So that beginning part was, well, tell us about effective and instructional practices from your perspective. And then I was asked to talk about coaching. And what do we know about coaching, what works, what doesn't work, what are our ideas, what's documented in the research. So I came in and also talked about coaching. That one might have even been one of those Zoom presentations, I can't remember. And then more recently, I was asked to talk about professional development, and with a particular emphasis on how do we achieve lasting change. So not just how do we support our teachers and our special educators, but how do we move that from here are some ideas, here's some guidance, to how can we make a real difference, and a difference that has some, what we sometimes call some, that really sticks, that has some lasting effect. And so I think that kind of follows the development of the project as well. That like, okay, well, what are we going to do? That was kind of the instructional practices part. What are we going to do? And then, well, as we get into how do we do it, we have to figure out how do we work with all of the adults, both in terms of coaching and then also in terms of ongoing professional development. So part of that work, well, I'm not getting anywhere, am I? There we go. So that leads me to this idea of collaboration. And I think collaboration is an easy word to use. We can stick it into our writing. We say we're doing a collaborative approach, and we're going to collaborate. So we can use the word, we can put it into our writing, but it's much more difficult to actually collaborate in everyday practice. And, along the way here, you've already heard some of the possible challenges to collaboration. And I'll point out some others as well, but there are some huge benefits to collaboration. So the first thing I thought about was collaborative research. Well, so we kind of describe that, define it as partnerships between and among those who are pursuing mutually interesting and beneficial research. But traditionally, collaborative research, the collaboration or the partnership, is between and among other researchers. So researchers are collaborating. They might be from different universities, but they have a shared interest, and they might plan and do a study at their different locations. Maybe they're in different departments, and they similarly plan and do studies in different locations with different groups of participants. But when we talk about collaborative research, it's often the researchers who are collaborating. And I want us to extend that thinking along the lines of collaborative research and practice. And that's what we've heard about today. And this makes it even harder. It's hard enough to get researchers to talk with each other. Now we have researchers who are talking, working with, cooperating, partnering, linking with all of those who may have a stake in the research project of interest, right? The topic or the issue or the problem. So it might be with families, it's with teachers, it's with administrators, it might be with policymakers. And so when we talk about collaborative research and practice, we're really interested in connecting the research itself with actual everyday practice. And another aim of collaborative research and practice is to promote a genuine desire to study issues that are important and relevant to all of these possible stakeholders, certainly the children, families, teachers, policymakers, and other stakeholders. And it means that we have to involve any and all of those stakeholders in the research process. As I was kind of putting this talk together, I was also working on a chapter. I was finishing up a chapter on collaborative approaches to professional development. And so what I'm going to try to do is bring together what we have learned about collaborative approaches to professional development to our thinking about collaborative research and practice. So in professional development, there are a number of approaches that involve groups. So we sometimes are talking about communities of practice. Sometimes we refer to the groups that are learning together as professional learning communities. We also have other kind of groups of collaborators that they might be referring to what they do as continuous improvement. So there are lots of terms that are being used around the people involved in professional development, how they are learning from each other, and how they're using their shared experiences to extend and expand on their practice. So this is the definition of communities of practice. This comes to us from Levin Wegner, who kind of originally brought this idea to the fore. They were anthropologists, and so it doesn't come to us from education. It comes from anthropology, and they observed people in a variety of professions, not in education, in a variety of professions, and observed this idea that they came to be known as communities of practice. They were groups of individuals who come together on the basis of a common professional interest and a desire to improve their practice in a particular area by sharing their knowledge, insights, and observations. So we now, in professional development, often talk about job-embedded learning, that you're learning on the job. And so that's, in some ways, is shared with this idea of communities of practice. So in their work, they looked at butchers, they looked at tailors and weavers and all sorts of different professions, and tried to figure out how it was that people were learning about their profession and learning how to become better, to improve themselves at their profession. And there are a couple of features that are really important to this idea of communities of practice, and that is what's called situated learning, or learning in the real situation, in the authentic situation, where it is that you do your work, your job. So that, again, this idea of job-embedded professional development. And then these groups of people with a shared interest come together and reflect on their experiences, share their experiences, comment on each other's experiences in an effort to improve, to learn about their practice, learn about their profession, and to improve their practice. So in the studies today, where the practices of interest were teaching instructional strategies, teaching strategies that had to do with improving social skills, improving play skills, improving language skills through a particular set of methods, we can see some of the ways that the special educators, the teachers, and others did come together to share their experiences. We can probably also imagine that there might be other ways that that people could come together in a way to learn more and to improve their practice. These are some of the features of communities of practice or professional learning communities. In the literature, there are actually distinctions in whether you're called a community of practice or a professional learning community or some other collaborative group, but we're not going to pay attention to those fine distinctions today. We're just going to take a look at some of the features of this kind of collaborative approach, if you will. So what they have in common is, first of all, they focus on authentic problems, issues, as well as successes. So again, today we learned about focusing on the issue, the topic of social skills, of play skills, of language skills. So it's an authentic issue, something that we've noticed. We are wondering what we can do about that. And so we share a focus of work. Another feature that any of these collaborative approaches have in common is ongoing reflection and analysis. So thinking hard about what we're observing, and wondering about what it might mean and how we can take what we're seeing and observing and perhaps change our practice. Another aspect of these collaborative groups, learning groups, is peer-to-peer support. And here I'm not talking about the children as the peers, I'm talking about the adults, right? So peer-to-peer support among the adults. And one of the things that we know from the adult learning literature is that adults learn best often adults learn best in social situations when they have others who are learning, who can provide them with models, with ideas, with feedback, with just reinforcement to keep on learning. So these collaborative groups can provide that in the form of peer-to-peer support. Another feature that these collaborative groups can have in common is that they can promote a culture of learning. So again, they're reinforcing each other, that we're not just satisfied with things as they are. We're not just satisfied with our teaching practices the way they've always been, but rather we're interested in learning new ways of teaching play skills, or we're learning new ways of storybook reading. Hey, I've been reading stories to my preschoolers for 25 years. There's another way of doing it? Yeah. What does it look like? How does it work? I tried this. It felt like this. But there's a notion that I want to learn about it, and I want to learn how to do it well. Some of these these learning groups, these collaborative groups, do the next one more than others. That's this idea of recurring cycles of inquiry, and that you plan what you're going to do, you do it, and you observe what happens. That's your data, and you use that data to maybe do it slightly different another time, in this continuing cycle. In research, we sometimes call this iterative design. So we're collecting the data, using the data, and tweaking it a little bit, making some changes if necessary, if we're not quite satisfied with the results, and in a continuous cycle of improvement. So the idea is that we have this culture of learning. We want to get better. We're going to be planful about it, intentional, and we're going to try things out. We're going to collect some kind of data, observational data, other kinds of data, and then we are going to use that information. It's going to inform our decisions. And so we see these notions of cultures of learning, recurring cycles of inquiry, continuous improvement in professional development, and also in administrative strategies for continuous improvement of my program in general. So we can kind of borrow this when we're thinking about linking or connecting research, educational research and practice. So I hope that you heard some examples of these features in the reports on the projects that were undertaken. I certainly heard some examples of peer-to-peer support. Maybe we could have done it more. It's worth thinking about. I heard some examples of thinking about the data, using the data, and using that to think about how we might do coaching differently, or how we might change our schedules of coaching and things like that. So the idea is to take advantage of these features of collaborative learning groups, and how can we use those in our research activities, in our kind of action research or authentic research, applied research, the kind of research that we've talked about today, so that we can, in fact, integrate educational research and practice. And one of the primary reasons for kind of emphasizing this idea of linking or integrating research and practice is that there's been this historic problem in educational research, and it's sometimes called the research to practice gap. And in fact, I was involved in a project that was called Bridging the Gap. You know, what are we going to do to bridge the gap between what we know from the research and making it happen in everyday classrooms and programs? Because traditionally, the researchers do this stuff, right? They go out and they do these research studies, and then they publish them, or they share them in a situation like this, and then say, well, okay, use it. And it doesn't always happen, right? And so we have to think about, a whole lot of energy has been put in place to think about how do you bridge that gap? What do we know? How do we make it happen in everyday practice? And so what I'm suggesting, what I'm saying is, what do we need to put into place in order to close that gap so it doesn't even, we don't have to worry about bridges? So, and certainly one of the ways is to have the research happen in the real setting. So you've done that. You did your research in preschool classrooms. Another way that we can close that gap is that the interventionist is not a researcher or the research associate or someone who is external to the program, but rather the person who's trying this out is the teacher. So you did that, and then you provided the supports, some of the supports in place to to make that happen, those practices occur with some fidelity, right? But there might be lots of other ways. There might be some other things in that list that we could somehow integrate into our research work in order to close or eliminate that gap, or so that we don't have to spend as much time or effort thinking about how do we make those new and innovative practices everyday practices. So here are some implications of making real efforts to collaborate, to integrate research and practice. There are both benefits and challenges to collaborative research and practice, and these are just some of them. Some potential benefits, I think you heard these. Maybe I'm putting different words on what you've heard, but certainly we have practical relevance. It was really fun to listen to the comments, the quotes from teachers, and in at least one case from a family member about it really made a difference. And I know that what you were doing made a difference for my child and for my family. It made a difference for my classroom and for my teaching. And that's, I think, largely in part to the fact that you're doing the research in the authentic setting with a shared issue, a shared topic. Another benefit of this approach to research is that you can use quantitative and qualitative data. And we saw that as well today. So we didn't see, in terms of, we didn't see a lot of charts and graphs and numbers. Rasmus tried to force us to see a few of those. But I know that there are numbers there that will be shared in the studies, in the published reports. So you can use quantitative data as well as qualitative data. Qualitative data can be particularly important in telling the story, and it means that it sounds like what other teachers or other administrators would be listening for in terms of, will it work in my program? Can I make it work? Collaborative approaches also allow us to gain in-depth knowledge and understanding of the problem. Because we have these opportunities to have real conversations about, well, what does it mean to use playtime social time? Or what is dialogic reading? And what is it trying to solve? And what's your view of that? And can we really describe it in a way that we will all understand it? And sometimes as we go through, do that work of describing it, detailing it so that we all understand it, we get a deeper understanding of both the method, but also what we're trying to solve, what we're trying to address. And then I've talked about this already a couple of times, this notion of just providing this culture, this climate of, we want to learn how to do something new. And we're learning how to do something new in order to improve outcomes, in order to improve teaching skills, in order to further the joy and enjoyment of learning when you're a young child and when you're a teacher of young children. And so that's clearly another benefit of our value of a collaborative approach. But there are challenges, right? I heard this one a lot already, the time that it takes. And today I heard mostly about the time it takes just to schedule the elements of the intervention itself, of the methodology, right? How do you schedule those meetings? How do you schedule the coaching? How do the teachers schedule the new intervention within their classroom activities? So that in and of itself has some challenges in terms of time. When you add to it this idea of collaboration and getting the adults together, whether you do it virtually or in person, that's another time element, that how can we all schedule our time so that we have opportunities to share and to think about and make sense of what we're seeing and what we're learning and what the data are telling us. And there are associated costs with all of those kinds of things. Some of which we already heard some solutions to some of those costs. I'm impressed with some of the things that the special educators did in terms of providing materials or going out and finding resources in order to provide materials, whatever incentives are to keep the work going. Another challenge when you're doing group work, and you've run into this, I know, is that we have diverse priorities. So if we get a group of people together, while we might for a little while decide we all want to help children with their social skills or their play skills, but we'll have some different ideas about just how important that is and how we're going to approach it, how much time we're going to spend on it. I might say, well, I think that's really important, but I think early mathematics is a little bit more important, so let's work on that first. So one of the challenges is negotiating those differences in priorities and perspectives, which can make your interventions and your research projects stronger, but it will also take time and negotiation skill. And then another challenge is how to maintain the rigor we need for this to be research that is trustworthy, that's believable. And one of the things that can potentially happen in this approach to research is the over-involvement of the researcher, which potentially can lead to bias in their interpretation of the findings. And so we have to be on guard about ensuring that the methods that we agree to and that we lay out are in fact the methods that are used. And then the ways that we have agreed to in terms of collecting the data are the methods that are used to collect those data. And then we can have greater confidence in what we're seeing when we take a look at the data and make sense of it. But again, this idea of it's not just a single study. It's not one research study and it's over. It's what did we learn from that? And now we get to change it up a little bit if we're not quite satisfied and move on to the next study. So it can be really exciting, right? To think about that idea. So I'm going to leave you with a few reflections and questions that I have. And I think some of these have been answered, maybe partially answered in the discussions earlier today. And you probably have other questions that are on your mind, because I'm not going to answer these. I'm just posing them. Have we integrated research and practice through collaboration, and have we used some of the features of collaborative work that I talked about? Are there other ways to integrate research and practice? Are there preferred ways? Are there ways that are a better match for your context? And what are those? It's worth thinking about. I just talked about this one. How do we maintain the rigor that we need in our research methods so that it is worth sharing with others and that it can potentially be replicated, it can potentially be extended? And how do we create and sustain the conditions for collaborative research and practice? So what are the conditions that need to be in place in our systems, in our classrooms and in our systems, in order for this collaborative work to happen? And how does it get reinforced? How does it get celebrated so that it's not just a chore, a task that takes effort and effort and effort, but it's worth doing? So how do we create and sustain those conditions? Now I'm going to, let me see how I can do this, because as I was listening, this is just a complete change of topic. It's not a bullet on this PowerPoint slide. So I was thinking about this when I was listening to the reports on the studies earlier. I think another next study is to talk to the special educators. I think they have learned a lot and have a lot to tell us, maybe about the studies themselves, but maybe about some of these collaborative methods that I've tried to touch on. And I was just imagining, a focus group kind of study where you do group interviews, maybe group interviews linked with individual interviews about what this was like and what it took. And we talk about a lot about doing research that matters and research that happens in the real life context. And I think everybody's perspective is important for us to find out about, but I was particularly interested in, maybe there's a study there let's listen to the role of the special educator, the coach, in making this happen. So those are the questions I'm going to leave you with. One idea for a research study. And I'm going to turn it over to Sam. And Sam is going to talk more about implementation and sustainability, right? Okay, thank you.